Few releases by Square Enix have come as anticipated as the Final Fantasy VII Remake, and upon its release, that anticipation led to fans rapidly devouring every bit of content the game had to offer, sharing all the Easter eggs, secrets, and references they had found with their respective communities. But even though the 7 Remake was its own entity, the original Final Fantasy VII cast an enormous shadow over the entire project and the Final Fantasy series as a whole, and it's for that reason that Square Enix decided to have this new retelling come with its own share of new content and new mysteries. Now, even though its release was still quite recent and the 7 Remake has been covered to death not only by fellow content creators and publications, but also Square Enix themselves, we still feel pretty confident that there are plenty of obscure stories that remain untold. And with the recent announcement of its sequel, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, that is set to launch in winter 2023, the time seemed right to take a bit of a closer look at the 7 Remake, with the objective of hopefully shedding some extra light on the game. So be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more high quality Final Fantasy content, and from what happened to Sector 6 through to the inspiration for Cloud's design, let's run through 7 Final Fantasy VII Remake facts you probably didn't know in our typical granular style, and we're going to start off with the soundtrack and how many people actually contributed to its success. Nobuo Uematsu was a prominent component when it came to building the Final Fantasy legacy, but after Final Fantasy X, he decided to take a step away from being an active participant in the creation of soundtracks. This shift would see composers like Hitoshi Sakamoto, Masashi Hamwazu, Yoko Shimomura, and Masayoshi Soken all helm a mainline entry, cast as the primary composer for their respective games. In some cases, multiple composers would even end up collaborating on a soundtrack, such as was the case in Final Fantasy X, and as Hamwazu also worked on that soundtrack with Uematsu, as well as the entire Final Fantasy XIII trilogy, he was used to the concept of collaboration. Now, given the sheer scale of the Final Fantasy VII Remake, even though Hamwazu was announced as the principal composer, something that meant his journey had come full circle, as in his younger days he actually featured as part of the iconic Sephiroth choir for the original version of One Winged Angel, there was also an expectation that he wouldn't be alone. But even though there had been the trend towards the number of individuals being involved with the production of soundtracks growing, nobody could have anticipated just how big the list of contributors would be for the Final Fantasy VII Remake original soundtrack. For reference, here's a fun chart we pulled together showing how these numbers have been growing over time, and it may be surprising for some of you to learn that so many people have been involved with these soundtracks since a lot of attention is often focused on one individual. Final Fantasy XV, for example, was almost 100% focused around Yoko Shimomura, despite almost 1/3 of the soundtrack being composed by her contemporaries and another bulk of work being done by arrangers such as Shoto Nakama, who used Shimomura's compositions as a base. With the 7 Remake, Hamwazu and Uematsu were the focal points, but when the soundtrack was released, we learned that there had been 25 different composers and arrangers who had contributed. Given that there was over 8.5 hours worth of music composed that features within the game, with plenty also being left on the cutting room floor, it's therefore not surprising that such a large volume of contributors were needed. But it has made the 7 Remake, we believe, the largest collaborative soundtrack to have ever been created in relation to Final Fantasy, and as a blanket statement that's bound to be proven wrong, perhaps even the largest soundtrack for collaboration in the history of video games. Now, with the release of Advent Children in 2005, many fans of the original Final Fantasy VII got to experience their beloved characters with full voice acting for the first time. Continuing to reprise their roles in a variety of future compilation of Final Fantasy VII projects, this cast, in all localizations, came to be very strongly associated with the iconic characters they portrayed. It was therefore quite a surprise to learn in the lead up to the release of the 7 Remake that the long-time cast had been replaced by an entirely new one. Yoshinori Kitase's official reasoning for the shift in casting was that the voice actors from Advent Children and the compilation were at that point too old to portray even younger versions of their characters, even though many of them had also voiced the characters in Crisis Core. What was really interesting about this claim, however, was that while the English voice cast was almost completely replaced wholesale, the Japanese, French, and German versions of the game maintained the bulk of their original compilation actors, with no explanation offered as to why the English cast was treated completely differently. Either way, it led to the casting of Cody Christensen as Cloud, Tyler Hoechlin as Sephiroth, and Gideon Emery, who had previously voiced Balthier, as Biggs. And this was very curious, as the trio were also appearing on another show together called Teen Wolf, which at the time of casting was a Viacom CBS property. Now, this is even more curious as some people did some sleuthing, and they found out that the majority of the voice actors cast for the 7 Remake had also been associated with Viacom's CBS properties such as Criminal Minds Beyond Borders, Transformers Revenge of the Fall, and even The Big Bang Theory. As a fun aside here, there is also a long history of shared projects between the voice actors in other regions, with one of the more wholesome being that the Japanese voice actors for Zack and Aerith, Kenichi Suzumura and Maya Sakamoto, who once again reprised their roles for the remake, have been married since 2011. Acting as one of the biggest set pieces in the original game, Midgar was not only the focus of much of the marketing for the remake, but it also occupied a special place in the memories of many fans. In reality, Midgar only accounted for a relatively small portion of the game, but such was its impact that even Kitase had gone on record saying that he misremembered the length of time players spent in the city, and he felt that characters and locations needed to be fleshed out as a result. Why this is interesting is that when looking at Final Fantasy VII as a whole, that relative length relates to the overall timeline of the game. When looking at a more or less confirmed timeline, the events of Final Fantasy VII took place over the course of a couple of months in total, from the beginning of the adventure until the defeat of Sephiroth. Based on this, it would therefore seem, according to granular breakdowns that people have done of the individual set pieces and assumed rest periods, that the time spent in Midgar was approximately 4 to 5 days. This translated into around 6 to 10 hours of gameplay for the standard player, which is in stark contrast to the 35 to 40 hours of length for the 7 Remake. And part of the reason for this is because instead of taking place over 4 to 5 days, the 7 Remake actually covers approximately 8 days of in-game time. This was revealed by the developers when they were talking about the various pieces of content that were added to the remake, with notable additions to the expanded timeline, including the fan-favourite Chapter 4 which took place prior to the Reactor 4 bombing mission, as well as new content related to Sector 7 and Sector 6, as well as plenty of additional Wall Market side missions. Time will tell how this altered timeline will play into the grander story of the 7 Remake and now Rebirth, but it just goes to show how much Square Enix wanted to develop and expand the existing world building and lore of Midgar. Now, by the time Final Fantasy VII had released, Square Enix had made a bit of a habit of killing off main characters. While older fans would have remembered the sacrifices of Teller in Final Fantasy IV and Galuf in Final Fantasy V, it was Aerith's famous death scene in 7 that became truly series-defining in the minds of many. Due to its impact, when it came to the remake, the death of Aerith loomed large over the project, and this was true for players but also the developers themselves, and it was for this reason that they chose to have some fun with expectations surrounding any permanent character deaths for the remake. President Shinra, as in the original game, met his end at the hands of Sephiroth at the top of the Shinra Tower. This time, however, Sephiroth also quickly claimed another victim before sprinting away to leave the party to fight against Jenova Dreamweaver, and that victim was Barret. While his demise was quickly reversed by the power of the Whispers, this moment gave many fans a huge shock that was quickly followed by confusion as to what exactly inspired this drastic departure from the original script. And that's where we come to the interesting bit, as Barret suffering a mortal wound was actually an old idea left on the cutting room floor from the original game. During the development of Final Fantasy VII, Tetsuya Nomura and Yoshinori Kitase debated with the other developers over which character should die over the course of the game. As they didn't want to kill Cloud, the debate raged between whether it should be Aerith or Barret who should die, with Aerith unfortunately winning due to Barret's role in the story making his death seem too predictable. As a fun aside here relating to Barret in general, within the 7 Remake Ultimania, it was revealed that the signature machine gun arm actually uses repurposed handgun bullets as a source of ammunition, and due to the fact the working loading mechanism is so delicate, it's implied that Marlene is the one who helps load the magazines, creating a very strange father-daughter bonding activity. Many of the mysteries from Final Fantasy VII that have persisted in the intervening years since its release have, by this point in time, been mostly solved. Whether it's via official developer comments, debunked cheat codes, or the compilation of Final Fantasy VII's world building, there are very few things left completely unexplained from the original game. But some items did still remain ahead of the release of the remake, and one of them related to Sector 6. When building out the new and improved Midgar for the remake, Square really wanted to make Midgar feel like a living, breathing city. In order to do this, extensive world-building documents were created to help push development towards its goal and provide background to the many, many staff artists and writers working on the game. Featured in the Ultimania, this background information helped to shine some light on a detail completely overlooked in the original game, that of what happened to Sector 6. In-game, Sector 6 was a trash heap full of monsters, a dangerous place with segments of broken highway, a design that was reflected in Remake. New to Remake though was the ability to freely look around and explore the area, and it was from this new vantage point that we would see that part of Sector 6's upper plate had fully collapsed and crashed into the slums below, explaining the wreckage and broken highway segments. The Ultimania goes on to explain that this sector actually fell during the construction of Midgar, but unlike Sector 7, which was of course dropped on purpose, Sector 6's collapse was a complete accident, and it was simply never repaired due to Shinra never allocating the funds to do so. This detail, as level designer supervisor Yui Sawada states, was originally intended to be a placeholder until a better story could be created, but in the end, the team ran with it, even giving Aerith dialogue in-game that confirmed the detail. Unlike the fall of the Sector 7 plate, which caused significant damage and casualties, the Ultimania notes that the casualties from the Sector 6 plate fall were extremely limited, as no one was living on the upper plate at the time of the collapse. As mentioned, many things were added to the 7 remake when the developers decided to expand the story of Midgar. Some, like the Whispers, remained controversial to fans, but others, such as the Chapter 4 story about visiting Jesse's home neighbourhood, ended up being much more well received for how they expanded and built upon the characters featured, far beyond what was possible within the game's original script. Roche, the bike-riding, cocky Shinra soldier, was another thing that was added to the tapestry of the Final Fantasy VII lore. Also featured during the aforementioned Chapter 4, Roche was encountered twice, once in the G-Bike segment where he was fought as a boss, and later as a one-on fight against Cloud. Given the amount of pomp and circumstance around his reveal, and the way he interacted with the player and Cloud, many expected him to play a much larger role within the remake, but sadly this was not the case. While it was discussed that he would appear towards the end of the game during the Shinra Tower highway escape sequence, he was unfortunately cut, making his appearance in the base game feel like a bit of a one-off, though he did appear as a Fort Condor opponent for Yuffie in the intermission expansion, and has since been confirmed to appear in Rebirth. Now it's unfortunate that Roche didn't get to play more of a role in Remake, as he was a favourite amongst the development team, but even though some of the team wanted Roche's character to be another generic soldier for Cloud to fight, according to scenario coordinator Manami Oishi, extensive research material and effort was actually put into his design. What's most interesting about this design, however, is that the source of inspiration seemed to come from a very specific cultural touchstone, the Gundam series. As one designer, Yoshihito Goto, explained, the team settled on the colour of Roche's G-Bike early on and decided that it would be red based on the entire team being in agreement over who Roche reminded them of, notably a certain masked antagonist who's known for being speedy and favouring the colour red. While not named specifically, this comment seemed to point to the Mobile Suit Gundam antagonist Char Aznavour. Known as the Red Comet, he favoured high-speed mobile suits and battle manoeuvres, and his charismatic personality parallels that of Roche's quite well. Taking this influence even further, there are a number of other characters across the series such as the Tallgeese pilot Trees, who also fit the favours the colour red and loves high-speed combat description mentioned by Goto, as well as a character even called Roche Notono, who also prefers red, making the Gundam connection to Roche even stronger. For our final fact today, we'd like to focus on everyone's favourite Buster Sword wielding protagonist, Cloud Strife, and more importantly, how when approaching the redesign for the 7 remake, the character designers actually took inspiration from ballet dancers when modelling his physique. Getting Cloud's design right was essential for the design team at Square, and making sure he looked true to the source material while also having him wield the iconic Buster Sword in a semi-realistic way was a difficult task. As character modelling director Masaki Kazano explained on the Square Enix blog, for Cloud to properly wield the Buster Sword, a massive and heavy weapon, he would have to be a massive bodybuilder type character. As this would have strayed too much from the original design for Cloud, they sought instead to find reference material that would reflect powerful physical fortitude, but also fit with Tetsuya Nomura's original design. This resulted in them taking inspiration from the muscular structure of professional ballet dancers. For reference, the Buster Sword is described as weighing 40 kilograms by Kazano, which, regardless of physical ability, would still be pretty difficult to wield in real life as effectively as Cloud does in the remake. That being said, it does seem like the design was able to achieve this goal, with Cloud seeming to be more capable of handling the weapon without altering its design too much, an important detail to get right, and one that endeared this version of the character to legions of new and old fans alike. And as one final fun bonus fact related to Cloud and dancing, we like to bring some attention to how the Honeybee in dance sequence, which has now become famous, could have been very different. In an interview with the Square Enix website, co-director Motomo Toriyama revealed that this sequence was originally going to feature a pole dancing segment as well, which would have been a very spicy addition to the routine, but it was ultimately cut, no doubt due to age rating concerns, leaving the potential for some of Cloud's more risque dance moves on the cutting room floor. And with that, I think we're done. They were 7 facts about the Final Fantasy VII Remake that you probably didn't know, but I'm sure there were still some amongst you who knew them all. Let us know in the comments below which fact you found to be the most interesting, and if you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. With that, this is Dara signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube members and supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, The Livestream and Zdawn, who are super special Onioner supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching the video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.